It's been something of a bit of a sticky week here in Washington, D.C., hasn't it? I mean, the president and his team have spent the whole week celebrating 6 months of success in this administration as they see it, while at the same time trying to outrun sinking mud and perhaps unsuccessfully trying to outrun that sinking mud around the Epstein files and what the White House does or doesn't know, what information it's trying to put out there, what information it's trying to hide. So it might be a useful time maybe for us to have a look back at the highs and lows of those 6 months and try and predict what might lie ahead and what might be still to come.
Yeah, we should be careful with predictions because we most certainly will be wrong, especially with the speed that this administration moves. But why not start with the economy? Because, we talk so often about this on this pod about tariffs, especially after Liberation Day when President Trump announced all the reciprocal tariffs. Well, here we are just heading towards that next August 1st deadline where those reciprocal tariffs are supposed to come into effect. And we've seen some significant trade agreements, most notably with Japan that President Trump announced just this week. And obviously, with such a large economy and trading partner, that is an important deal. It was interesting. I was speaking to an economist, and, we've spoken to so many economists over the last few months on our programs about, do these tariffs, what are the impact, are they affecting the economy? And he said, at the moment, we're kind of in a holding pattern. I mean, I don't know how you guys see it.
I kind of see that as, the administration promised dozens of tariffs right around the corner just a few months ago after Liberation. And even though they do have a few wins they can point to, it's certainly not at the pace that they kind of teased that it would be. And I think, perhaps more problematic for them for the next 6 months, that polls show that Americans aren't really all that convinced about the tariffs and how it would benefit them. So I think looking forward a bit, I think that's kind of going to be part of the big messaging drive over the next 6 months, is especially if more agreements come in, how this actually benefits people.
And tied into the economy and the tariffs, of course, was the big campaign promise from President Trump to bring inflation under control, wasn't it? And I mean, we have seen inflation come down a little bit. It's hovering in and around 2.7%, I think was the figure for last month. So, still a ways off the Fed's target of 2% that it's hoping to get things to. But at the same time, consumers aren't really feeling that. I mean, we heard the White House say this week so many times prices are coming down, but they're not coming down across the board. Consumer sentiment has started to rise from where it was in February, but it's nowhere near where it was in December in the wake of the election, when there was this big bump in consumer sentiment in this country, where people had great high hopes of what President Trump would deliver on that key issue of cost of living. And that still seems at this point something that he's really struggling trying to get a handle on. And I think that's why we've seen a focus on many other issues, and they try and kind of get away from that. So I would expect now in the next few months a bigger focus back on that as people head into another winter. They start thinking about the holiday season, looking at how much cash is in their budget and realizing, actually, I'm not better off and I don't have any, better spending power than I did last year.
Especially because the economists I've spoken to have said that, we still haven't seen the real impact of tariffs. We've started to see a little bit of that inflation tick up. You were mentioning the consumer price index from, I think it was last week, showing that household products and products that are affected by tariffs, so clothing, for example, or furniture you're buying, that's starting to tick up slightly. And that is the first impact we've seen from tariffs. But the economists we've spoken to have said, look, at the moment, the economy is still strong. Job growth is strong. Growth of the economy is strong. And inflation has only slightly ticked up in some sectors. But the next 6 months, if we're talking about what to expect, could indeed be really critical.
And even if the White House is really quite often very dismissive of polling, there is a lot of polling that suggests that people don't think they're doing nearly enough in terms of lowering prices overall.
Yeah.
I was just reading one poll from our partners over at CBS, and it said 7 in 10 Americans don't think the administration is doing enough to lower prices. And if I was sitting in the White House, I think that would ring quite a lot of alarm bells, with the midterms really not that far away. That's not a statistic I think they really want to see, which again, I think is, as you mentioned, part of the reason we're seeing them shift the conversation on from this a little bit when they can.
Mm. We also hear the president talk a lot, though, don't we, about the tariff take, how much it's putting into the coffers in this country, and the billions and billions and billions. And he loves to tell that story of how, a guy rings him and tells him there's 60 billion or 80 billion extra dollars, and they don't know where that's come from. And they say, oh, well, sir, that's come from the tariffs. So there is money coming in from those tariffs, even if there isn't a kind of firm plan for many countries. And, the EU, as we're taping this, there's no firm deal there either, the biggest trading partner. But there is an uncertainty there because of that I think is still creating this extreme nervousness. Again, that's many of the economists' view is like, okay, well, it wasn't as bad initially as perhaps we thought it was, but that's because we don't have as many firm deals as we thought there would be. And that uncertainty is still there. And, speaking to voters in the early days of this Trump administration, and they very much bought into that philosophy that the president had of short-term pain for long-term gain. And we're now 6 months down the road, and it's like, okay, well, how long-term is long-term, right? I mean, we talked about that a lot on the pod over the last few months. Are we now coming over that point when people get out of their summer vacations of, okay, there is no gain for me here?
And the messaging from the administration, I think, has been very clear, is to point to the money that, as to your point, Katrina, that is coming in from tariffs. I think at this point, it's $100 billion from the analysts I've spoken to. But interesting to note that one of the analysts I was interviewing on one of our programs said, if you spread that out over a year, that's about 2% of what you would normally expect from government revenue. So, if that is the offset for some of the price shock that you might see from tariffs, it's not perhaps going to be the boon that the administration had hoped it would be, at least at this point, with the tariffs that are on certain products and on certain countries.
And there's still that threat of retaliatory tariffs in the cases where there isn't an agreement. For example, I mean, at the time we're recording this, there's no agreement with the EU, and they've made it very clear that there's still options on the table. Same with Mexico. And I mean, if those retaliatory tariffs come into play and that impacts American businesses, then it becomes much harder for the administration to kind of sell this as one of the wins of the first 6 months or the first year of the administration.
The other big win, of course, on the domestic policy front, you would have to say from President Trump's viewpoint, is immigration. Yeah. All the promises that they made about, closing off the borders and so on. I mean, we have seen a dramatic reduction in the number of people coming to the US without paperwork, trying to get here. And as was said by Caroline Leavitt, the press secretary this week in the White House, for the second month in a row, no illegal or undocumented migrants have been allowed into the US. That old system of they cross the border, present themselves to Border Patrol, be processed, given a court date, and then let go and join their relatives some part in America. That's been zero for the last 2 months, which they are celebrating as a massive victory. But the mass deportation plan, which the White House says is underway, I mean, the big numbers that the president was tossing around, deporting 1 million people and so on, we're nowhere near that at this point. I mean, I think the latest is a couple of 100,000 at this point.
I was just actually looking at the numbers before we started recording, and if things continue as they are, they'll be at about 300,000 for the year, which is on par with Obama, for example, but is well short of the million that they promised. I still think this is very
still
much
less than Obama. I mean, I think Obama was 316,000, which was something in the first Trump administration that he was always trying to get to that benchmark. So I think the frustration we're seeing maybe is, because we know he likes to compete, doesn't he, is that he's not hitting that number.
And even though I think they'll still be kind of claiming this as perhaps, the greatest victory of the first 6 months being immigration, polling also shows that support for the deportations is starting to slip. I mean, it's still obviously very high among Republicans, but among Americans more broadly, the levels of disapproval for how this is being carried out are rising. I still think the administration would shrug off that data, but in the longer term, one wonders, at what point do things tip in terms of public opinion?
And if we start talking about what's next, let's say in the next 6 months, I think that the change in the administration's language portends what we will see, which is a massive ramping up of deportations, of illegal immigrants, undocumented migrants who don't have criminal convictions. We've heard so many administration officials and Republican strategists I've been speaking to on our programs as well who have said, well, crossing into the country illegally is in itself committing a crime. So that makes a migrant in this country illegally also a criminal. That's some of the wording that I've heard from strategists I've spoken to somehow justify how a mass deportation scheme would then sweep up far more people than President Trump himself had said that they wanted to target. And you are starting to see a bit of that pushback. We've talked about it here before on this pod about ICE raids in certain Democrat cities where you see residents come around and try to protect those who are being targeted for deportation. But on the other hand, if we think about the impact of tariffs down the road, I really do wonder if you're going to start to see that knock-on effect in some of the businesses, in some of the farms, the hotel industry, if that will start to become a bit of a problem for the administration as well.
I mean, we've heard those rumblings already, haven't we?
Yeah.
When it comes to things like farm laborers, when it comes to jobs in the hospitality industry, kind of all these low-paid positions that Americans don't want to do and that have long relied on immigrant labor to do, that's going to start biting in some of those neighborhoods as well, where people are now afraid to come to work, even if they've worked, albeit without paperwork, for a farmer for a couple of years now. Suddenly they don't want to come because they fear that ICE agents are kind of waiting at the gate, as we saw that instruction for people to target Home Depot stores, which are giant hardware stores for those who aren't familiar with America, where there was always a tradition, wasn't there, that you could go there, buy whatever you need, and then find a person who could come and put your fence up or fix your bathroom or whatever it was and pay them cash, and that was the end of that. So that was viewed rather cynically as well. I do think, though, the passage of the Big Beautiful Bill, or Act as it is now, and how much cash, the billions and billions that gives to ICE agents and to courts and the various kind of parts of that deportation immigration process, will allow them, from the White House perspective anyway, to really ramp that up, that suddenly they will have all this money. They can pay the overtime for agents. We've talked about Alligator, Alcatraz, plans for more of those to be built. We've seen how quickly that can be built, and we've seen also the terrible living conditions that people in those facilities are facing. There's a legal challenge through the courts, and of course much of the president's immigration plan so far has faced legal challenges at each and every point along the way.
And I think it's very telling that in now that we're starting to see over the next few months, there'll be kind of a messaging push by the administration to make the case for the one beautiful bill to normal Americans and why it benefits them, especially because polls show that many of them don't necessarily know the specifics of what's in there. JD Vance was on a trip to Pennsylvania recently, and he said that in his view, everything else in the bill is almost immaterial when compared to immigration and border enforcement. So I think that's going to be such a big part of the messaging effort, because they see that as something that he campaigned on and that he has concrete results that are really kind of hard. It's hard to argue with the numbers that we've seen at the border. And for example, I think that's going to play such a big part, even if they, also have to talk about no tax on tips and everyday economics for Americans. It's still going to play such a central role in the next 6 months of the White House's messaging.
And the removal of so many millions of Americans from Medicaid, their medical welfare benefits. But I mean, the passage of that bill of itself was a massive win for this president, given how down to the wire it came in the House and in the Senate. And all of that was happening at the same time as massive developments on the world stage in geopolitics and foreign affairs. And, again, that's another area, isn't it, where the president can point to great successes, but also not quite losses, but non-action, if you want to call it that. I mean, as he came into office, there was a temporary ceasefire in Gaza. We look at the situation there now, the absolutely abominable situation on the humanitarian front, where everyone now, it seems, in the country is at risk of starvation, and talks there seem to be crumbling, and very limited progress, it would appear, in Russia, Ukraine as well.
Yeah, I think this has actually been a pretty mixed bag on the foreign stage for the president. On the one hand, His administration, of course, very quick to point to what they see as a massive success in the bombing campaign of Iran's nuclear sites. And of course, that freed up some room, if you will, for Israel in its negotiations, perhaps changed the playing field a bit in negotiations. But if you look beyond that, I mean, we really have seen an arc with Ukraine, Russia in particular, where you saw that meeting between Presidents Trump and Zelensky in February, that infamous blow up in the White House. And then, of course, the re-establishing of that relationship. And now President Trump changing his language on Putin. But at the end of the day, if you look at where things stand right now, both sides are no closer to reaching a ceasefire agreement. We saw talks in Istanbul taking place where they ended after 40 minutes. I mean, clearly there's no progress there. And if you talk to the Ukrainians, as we have often on our programs, they have said this is what we've known all along. And President Trump seems truly vexed by this, truly vexed by Putin's lack of willingness to come to the negotiating table or really stop bombing Ukraine.
And I find it really notable that when I'm at the White House and listening to Trump, with the exception of Iran, the major foreign policy wins he mentions are ones that really, I think, are fair to say are kind of far from the minds of most Americans. He often points to Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, India and Pakistan, which of course was perhaps more high profile here, but also the U.S. role in stopping what was happening is slightly unclear and debated in India, for example. And then, Kosovo, for example. These aren't things that I think most Americans are really thinking about, whereas Gaza and Ukraine really eat up a lot of coverage on US networks, for example. So I think, until he has another kind of high profile win like he did with Iran, for example, I think it's really hard for him to make the argument that he's really the peacemaker that he often says he is.
Although we do hear from the White House team repeatedly about how he has 3 nominations for the Nobel Peace Prize at this point, which of course has been something that's been discussed for a long time about how this is a goal of his to win that Peace Prize. You could say, though, that a success on the foreign policy stage was in terms of NATO and getting the member countries to, up their donations from 2%, 3% to get to 5%. That's something that President Trump had long talked about and there had been great resistance to. So he went from, do we need NATO? What's it all about? I don't know if America should be a member of NATO anymore, to suddenly 5%. And the love bombing, excuse the pun, that he had at that NATO meeting a couple of weeks ago. And the NATO Secretary General, Mark Rutte, came back then for a visit afterwards. And, that's when you see the US turning away from many, many international organizations. That's one that it does seem to be leaning into at the moment.
I do wonder if we look at the next 6 months ahead, if we're going to see far more of a focus on China. Obviously, we know that negotiators are still talking on both sides about a trade agreement. We've heard rumblings as to whether they might be nearing an agreement on a number of products. And we know that President Trump also often touts his relationship with President Xi. But as we've seen this frustration on the Ukraine war, and also on the ability to get a ceasefire in Gaza, we could see the administration really shift to other foreign policy priorities and seeing China as a strategic rival in the region, but also an important trading partner. I think that relationship, I wouldn't be all that surprised if that kind of comes to the forefront in the next phase of the administration's foreign policy posture.
Well, the president has said he's got an invitation to meet Xi Jinping and that he will accept that invitation. Obviously, we don't have a time or anything on that. The next big trip for the president that we know about will be the state visit to the UK in September, which he is very, very excited about and eagerly awaiting that little holiday in Scotland, of course, beforehand, but then that big return visit there. But yeah, I mean, China just percolates through everything else really that the administration is doing. I mean, if you think back at the beginning of the administration, we were talking about Greenland, we were talking about Panama. Yeah. They don't feature at all in the conversation in the last couple of months. The narrative has really shifted, but I don't think the intent has gone away though.
I certainly think those things will come back at some point. Maybe it might not even be in the next 6 months, but the administration certainly hasn't forgotten what it said there about Panama and Greenland, for example. I think China is perhaps just going to be more priority given the size of the economy and the importance. I mean, China really is, their economy is very important to everyday Americans and vice versa. So I think that's perhaps more of a sell if they can point to a win there than Greenland or Panama, which I don't think necessarily many Americans are particularly thinking about either, and kind of and weren't before the administration brought up these suggestions.
We don't have long left, but I just want to talk a little bit about interpersonal affairs, let's say vibes, culture, whatever you want to call it, at the White House, because I'm reminded of, the first Trump administration. Those first early months in 2017 were all about a changing of personnel, who was in, who was out, people came and went. Whereas what the president has managed to do is hold on to huge numbers of his team, notwithstanding a lot of gossip and palace intrigue coming out of the White House. Maybe top of the list, person who had the highest of the high and the lowest of the lows, maybe Elon Musk, the big bromance that was there at the start. And now you're at a point where the president said during the week that he's going to look and see, no one in the US government should have a contract with Grok, the AI chatbot, and that it belongs to Elon Musk, is kind of embedded in his X platform. So, there's a high and low in just that one relationship.
Yeah, indeed. And if you look at some of the other relationships that have been discussed, we really saw the ascent of Marco Rubio for the now 4 roles that he holds, and obviously very significant ones, and also just the relationship that he's developed with the president. I'll be really interested to see what the fate of Pete Hegseth holds going forward, the Secretary of Defense. We talked about Signalgate and about the tenuous nature of his post, even his confirmation hearings at the time when he was named to the post. But I had spoken to a few sources who say that they still believe that some of the missteps that the defense secretary has made, and the fact that he has essentially not a top level staff around him, because many of those people have left or been dismissed from the Secretary of Defense, from the Pentagon, from his office, that because of that, he has not made the best decisions. So remember, for example, we talked about the fact that weapons to Ukraine were paused. Weapons shipments to Ukraine were paused, and apparently the president had no knowledge of that. And we saw that press conference, or that press availability, with Pete Hegseth sitting next to Donald Trump, and he was asked about weapons for Ukraine. He said, we have to give them to him. We need them. And just to watch the Secretary of Defense's face there was really interesting. I mean, to this point, Donald Trump has stood behind Pete Hegseth, but just to the sources I've spoken to, I do wonder if his is a one position that could still be quite murky going forward.
I don't know. I think it suits the president to have Pete Hegseth in that role, because he's kind of, notwithstanding that issue on Ukraine, but he's kind of an extremely close ally. He perhaps is not going to push back that maybe somebody else in that role would. And, on the issue of the weapons to Ukraine, the messaging from the president has now become, oh, yeah, well, Pete Hegseth did the right thing in stopping those weapons pending a review. That was the appropriate thing that had to be done. And we were doing a department-wide review. So really changing of the narrative there as well.
And I do think this administration, more than anything, really does value loyalty, and there not being public disagreements, which we really haven't seen from Hegseth. I mean, there may have been disagreements behind the scenes, for example, about Ukraine, but we haven't seen any sort of highly publicized disagreement between the two. On Tulsi Gabbard, on the other hand, for example, when the Iran strike happened, you'll all remember how much reporting there was about her previous assessment of Iran versus what the president was saying. And I think that sort of thing is something that the president and the White House really don't want to have there being any kind of, at least publicly, light between people.
I think there's a lot that we could get into, which we haven't had time for today, in terms of the exercising of grievances that we have seen. So I don't know, maybe we might need to address that next week in a special episode, because, this was also the week when we heard terms like crooked Hillary and the Russia hoax from the podium in the White House. And it's some time since we've heard those terms. And our long episode on Epstein last week, we barely mentioned him this week, but I think we will be talking about that next week.
For weeks to come. For weeks to come, yeah.
Okay, all good right. To chat as always, guys.
See you soon.
Bye.
Bye. If you enjoyed this episode of The President's Path, then like and subscribe to our YouTube channel. We would love to hear from you, so do please leave us a comment below or you can email us on path@bbc.co.uk.